As I was meditating on the second reading from St. Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, this image came to mind, this scene. I imagined myself running as fast as I can. I'm running, and there's this huge boulder that's rolling towards me that's going to crush me. And the only place I can run is forward. And the sweat's going down, and my heart's pounding. And as I'm running forward, I realize I'm coming to the edge of a cliff. And there's another cliff opposite, about a 10, 15 feet jump. There's no way I could make that jump. And as I'm thinking I'm going to die, all of a sudden, Jesus shows up out of nowhere. And he says something awesome like, "You didn't think I'd let you down, did you?" And he pulls out a whip like in Indiana Jones, and he thrusts it forward, and it wraps around some limb hanging over the precipice. And he says, "Hold on." And I hug him, I grab onto him, and I'm holding him as tight as I can. I throw my arms around him, and we start swinging over. And as we're swinging over, I'm smiling. I'm hugging him tight, and we make it to safety. And the thought comes to mind, I wouldn't mind doing that again. And I believe this is the attitude that God is inviting us to have towards our weaknesses, our trials, our temptations. To have a positive attitude like St. Paul, rejoicing in our weakness for the sake of clinging closer to Christ and letting him be our strength. That's God's invitation today, to rejoice in our weakness for the sake of clinging closer to Christ and letting him be our strength. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. This is one of the most comforting, one of the most consoling, one of the most encouraging teachings of Jesus. My grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. This is the guarantee that whatever our trial, whatever our tribulation, whatever our temptation or suffering, that God is going to be especially present to us, especially close to us in that moment. And he is going to give us everything we need to get through it. He's going to give us everything we need to deal with our own thorns in the flesh. What was the thorn in St. Paul's flesh? It's not revealed exactly what it was, but meditating on the possibilities can help us get a sense of our own thorns in our flesh and how to respond to them positively. Whatever it was, the fathers of the church agree that it was something he found particularly humiliating and something he believed really hindered his work of spreading the gospel. St. Augustine and some of the other fathers thought that the thorn in St. Paul's flesh was a bodily suffering, some bodily ailment, some bodily pain. And there's the suggestion that it was poor eyesight. In Galatians chapter 4, he mentions, "You know it was because of a bodily ailment that I preached the gospel to you at first." And later on in chapter 6 of Galatians, he mentions, "See, I write to you in my own large handwriting." So maybe it was that he had failing eyesight, or it could have been some other bodily pain. One of our priests said maybe he actually had this tiny little demon on his elbow or his shoulder that had a thorn and would poke him every once in a while. I found that kind of funny. But whatever it is, we can relate to it if we have some physical ailment. Perhaps we have allergies that plague us on a regular basis. Perhaps we have trouble keeping our weight down. Perhaps we have a chronic back pain, leg pain, hip pain. Perhaps some debilitating illness such as multiple sclerosis. Perhaps we have to make very frequent trips to the bathroom. And we might have thought, like, oh, if only I didn't have to deal with this. Well, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Let us believe God is using it for some good, for the good of souls, perhaps the conversion of sinners, and he is going to give us the strength. Ask him for the strength to bear it with patience. Another possibility was that the thorn in St. Paul's flesh was persecution. This was what St. John Chrysostom and other fathers thought it was. And looking to the book of Numbers, chapter 33, verse 55, that phrase, thorn in the flesh, is used as a Hebrew idiom that refers to people persecuting you or harassing you. So perhaps that's the thorn that you might be dealing with. It could be a family member, it could be a coworker, it could be your boss or anyone else who just seems to always be against you, perhaps insulting you, perhaps sabotaging your work, maybe even telling lies about you and trying to turn others against you. And to the extent possible, sure, we want to try to avoid those relationships, but if for some reason we're in this situation and we're not able to get out of it, well, again, trust that God is using it for some good, that God is working through it. Ask Him for the strength to bear it. Cling closer to Christ. And another possibility for St. Paul's thorn was that it was some temptation. St. Gregory the Great and others think that it was some inclination to sin that he found particularly difficult to resist. Perhaps falling or perhaps not falling, but still very difficult to fight against it. And it'd be nicer if I didn't have to struggle against this on a regular basis and just focus on spreading the gospel. This could be us. It could be inclination to gossip. Could be a strong inclination to lose our temper, to be very impatient and get angry at others, to snap at them. Could be a inclination to gamble. Could be various addictions, alcohol, drugs, in sexual impurity, right? Thoughts that just keep pervading us, coming into our mind, and we have to keep fighting them. The thought comes to mind, if only I didn't have to deal with this, life would be so much simpler. But my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. St. Paul asked 3 times for his thorn to be removed. Perhaps we've asked 50, even 100 times for God to take something away. If it's a temptation, we still have to keep dealing it. We might have to deal with that one our whole life long. Trust that there is going to be benefit. God will be our strength. For a while I was thinking, what does this mean? My power is made perfect in weakness. It seemed mysterious to me. My power is made perfect in weakness. And what we can gather from that is that with God's help, even though we're weak, when we have our fallen human nature, and we might be especially inclined to some sin, with God's help, we are going to be stronger against that sin than we would be if we didn't have that weakness, but we didn't have God's help. Another way to think of it, maybe it's a little clearer, if we have 2 people, one has a lot of natural virtue, they're not so weak to fall into a certain sin like impurity or something else, and this other person, they're really weak, they're very inclined to it, and they have to struggle a lot. Well, if this person calls on God and this one doesn't, the stronger one doesn't call on God, in the end, the one who's naturally more weak is going to have greater strength. God is going to give us a share in His superpower, and God is going to triumph over Satan with us. And this shows God's greater power when He triumphs over Satan using weak instruments. The thought comes to mind of a sword fight. Someone pulls out a sword, and God pulls out a spoon and is able to defeat that person with a spoon. Right? God is glorified when we triumph over Satan with God's help. So knowing that we have this help, then we can believe that giving in is never inevitable. And we might be tempted, Satan might tempt us to think that it's just impossible. I can't do this. I'm going to fall. There's just no way. No, giving in is never inevitable. Right? With God's help, it's always possible to triumph over a temptation. We hear St. Paul tell us in another part of his letters that God will not allow us to be tempted beyond our strength. And we might think, well, it seems so, right? This just seems so overwhelming. It seems like He is letting me be tempted beyond my strength. No, that's a lie of the devil. Right? God will not allow us to be tempted beyond our strength, and that means our strength when we have His help, when we turn to Him, when we call upon Him. Giving in is never inevitable. This can keep us from having a bitterness or an anger towards God even. The thought that, why do you let me keep dealing with this temptation? You're the one, it's your fault. Like, why don't you just take this away? You could. No. If we fall, it's not because God failed us. It's not God's fault. If we fall, then ultimately it's because in some way we didn't correspond enough with God's grace. And it's humbling to hear that, but it's true. God was offering us sufficient grace to overcome that fall. So my grace is sufficient for you means if we want to resist, we want to triumph over temptation, we can. We can do it with God's help. Why does he allow us to be tempted at all? It's very useful to recall the benefits of temptation. Why does God allow it? There's at least 5 different benefits of temptation. One is growing in self-knowledge, getting to know ourselves, how much we love God. When we're tempted, we can realize how much we love him by how quickly did I start resisting? How strongly did I try to defeat this? Did I just give in right away? Well, then I don't have as much love for God. But if I'm struggling, even if I fall in the end, all that time I'm fighting, that shows, yes, I do love God. I didn't want to do this. Another benefit, a second benefit, is the glory of God and the humiliation of the devil when we do triumph. We think of Job, right? And Satan going to God and God saying, have you noticed my servant Job? And that there's no one like him? Right? Satan hates it when he loses, when he fails, and when we resist temptation out of love for God. A third benefit of temptation, growth in virtue. Right? The more we're tempted, the more we have to resist it, the stronger we're going to get. And God calls us to become great saints. We think, it would be so much easier if I didn't have to deal with this. We're not called to an easy, comfortable life. We're called to become saints, and regular temptation helps us do that. St. Catherine of Siena, she was plagued for a time with pervading impure images and impure thoughts, and she thought of herself as like, it's just so weak, and she thought she was displeasing God, but she was fighting the whole time. And in the end, God revealed to her this beautiful soul, and she was so surprised to realize that he told her that was her soul. Right, and the glory of it, because she had struggled with so much love for God against these impure thoughts. Right, so we want to recognize we're growing in virtue. Distractions at prayer, that might be our thorn. We're trying to pray and just these distractions just keep coming to mind. I can't keep my mind focused on prayer. Well, every distraction, every time we turn our mind back to God, it's a practice in virtue. And eventually it will become easier. Fourth reason for temptation, great benefit, humility. Our humility is so important to keep us away from the pride that's the root of all sin. Humility when we do fall. We realize, okay, God, this is what happens when I don't turn to you fast enough, when I don't cling to you strongly enough. Of course, Lord, without you, I'm going to fail. And this can help us recognize our utter dependence on God, that we depend on God every single moment of every single day. Happy Independence Day, by the way, to everyone. Of course, we rejoice in the independence of our nation, but let us not forget, as creatures, we are always dependent on God. And to keep us from becoming those rebels mentioned in the first reading, from rebelling against God, thinking we can have a comfortable, good enough life without him, he will let us fall in temptation. He will humble us so that at least he'll keep us from the pride. And when it comes to impurity, I read somewhere that in many cases it's that God's letting us fall into this temptation to impurity to keep us humble, to keep us from some pride. So if that's our thorn, we might examine, do I have a lot of pride in some area of my life? Where do I need to humble myself before God? And maybe that will help alleviate some of that temptation. God will take mercy on us. He'll have mercy on us and take away the temptations of the devil a little more. A fifth benefit of temptation, the glory of God's mercy. And when we fall, we repent of our sin and confession, we turn to God's mercy. His mercy is his greatest attribute, and it's glorified after our falls. And there was a young man we heard about in one of our retreats for the Fathers of Mercy. The priest said there was a certain young man who he was so happy that to the best of his memory he had never committed a mortal sin. But at a certain point, he fell into a sin, and as he spoke about it with a priest, they came to realize that the priest judged to the best of his knowledge, I think this was a mortal sin. And the person was so distraught and so depressed and so sad. And the priest consoled him, asking him the question, when it's all said and done, when we're in heaven, would you rather be able to boast that you had never fallen into a mortal sin, or to glorify God for his great mercy? And that really brought consolation. That helped him to cheer up and to rejoice in his weakness, for the sake of Christ. Considering all this, we can have that positive attitude toward temptation. We can stop fearing it. This was enlightening for me to read in one of the reflections this week, that we're not meant to fear temptation. Because we know that Christ is going to be especially close to us and give us his strength, and that with that it's always possible to triumph, then we need not fear temptation. That's not to say that we run towards temptation or desire it. No, that would be foolish. But yes, knowing that we're going to be tempted, right? Whether our dominant fault or any other area, we're going to be tempted. We know it's coming, but we don't have to be afraid, knowing that Christ will be with us. The positive attitude that we can have towards temptation is reflected in Psalm 91. This is the psalm that priests and religious pray every Sunday during night prayer. Part of that psalm is, "He will give his angels charge over you to guard you in all your ways. On their hands they will bear you up, lest you dash your foot against a stone," lest we fall in temptation. "On the lion and the viper you will tread. You will trample the young lion and the dragon," triumphing over Satan's temptation with God's help. "Since he clings to me in love, I will free him." I love that. God saying, since he clings to me in love, I will free him. I will deliver him. "I will protect him, for he knows my name." Let us prove we know the name of God by calling upon him in temptation. There was a priest, he said, whenever he found himself severely tempted, he'd say, "Jesus, Mary, save me." And we know Mary's intercession is also very powerful as the Mother of God. "With length of life I shall content him. I shall let him see my saving power. When he calls, I shall answer, I am with you." I am with you. So let us rejoice in our weakness. Let us feel encouraged in temptation, recognizing that opportunity to be closer to Jesus. And let us go forth with that defiant cry of St. Paul, "What can separate us from the love of God? If God is for us, who can be against us?"